Hi, Jerry. How are you?
Hi, good. You?
Good. It's good to see you. So just to set us up from the top, you and I had the pleasure to work together for many years when I was the head of philanthropy and you were the head of global supply chain,
Yeah.
and had many conversations during that time about your work and social impact and how it intersected. Um, I think that's more true today than ever. And just wanted to take the opportunity to ask you a few questions and tease out some of these things that you've been thinking about and I've been thinking about for over a decade. You've been doing this work for 25 years, which is impossible because you're like, 30. What are the three most notable innovations in supply chain that you've seen in the almost 3 decades you've been doing this?
Yeah. You know, big impacts. I see robotics and automation and the pace at which robotics and automation is impacting, the supply chain. The reach that global sourcing has and the dependence into, as it gets into the emerging markets around the world. And then the dependence on plastics that as global sourcing has reached out into these places, like the practicality from a producer point of view, and a supply chain point of view, what works in a supply chain versus maybe what works for us as a planet and as a species. So plastics being maybe the third one to say, innovation and curse at the same time.
So perfect segue to ESG. ESG, of course, is environment, social, and governance. It's a buzzword. Companies are talking about it, thinking about it. Talk to us about how supply chain fits into the broader ESG landscape and what you think of as a supply chain leader when you hear the term ESG.
I think supply chain leaders around the world are in a different kind of context than have been in the past. Um, the global supply chain crisis, as it's called, that we're operating in, where few, if any, industries are not in a complete tailspin around the volatility of demand and supply that we've had since the beginning of COVID. And now, we've a lot of industries have been without inventory for a long time, and now all of a sudden, a number of industries have a lot of inventory, have maybe too much inventory, have some of the wrong things, that as things that are tougher to sell at the moment. So there's a lot of stress in supply chains, and you know supply chain teams are fighting really for survival every day, and so the ability to focus and truly focus on ESG has been interrupted, truthfully. And that being said, there's genuine determination to do good things across pretty much all the supply chains that I've got visibility into. I see investments in reducing impacts in the environment and everything from packaging choices to renewable energy. And these things are not because the business case makes sense, but rather because these are the right things to do. So, people are looking at this thing in the right way. Um, I go back to the plastics thing.
Yeah.
It's public enemy number one for brands. Supply chains have got to innovate their way out of the innovation trap that has been, plastics. For example, California's, Bill 54 that regulates plastics, and it right now is putting the responsibility for the first time is putting responsibility for the actual recycling of the plastics on the producers of those plastics, and that's a big change. Whether other states will follow, we'll see. But Canada is moving in that same direction as well, and that may be a catalyst for a wholesale change in how supply chains approach using plastics. And, you know, a lot of different industries have used plastics, you know, again, because they were practical from a producer's or, you know, a shipper's point of view. They were cheap and easy, and were solutions for a lot of different problems. They may not be the cheap and easy way in the future, depending on, you know, how these things, you know, eventuate.
That's what the California legislators are sort of hoping, right? That it makes it less cheap and less easy. No, it's a great point. You know, one of the things you and I talked about when we were prepping for this is, you know, the movement for businesses to really think more about diversity, equity, and inclusion, DEI.
Yeah.
And I was interested to hear kind of your perspective on how that's playing into supply chain and supply chain leadership. If you could speak to that, that would be great.
Yeah, it's an area that's long overdue. Won't say it's a universal, but I see very widespread understanding that diverse teams are not only the right thing, but also they produce superior results. And there's an understanding growing about this. You know, there's a recent study by the universities of Arkansas and Akron, and they found that in supply chain simulations, operations that were either entirely led by women or that at least had significant representation by women, as, you know, as participants in these simulations, wound up being more efficient and collaborative than the ones that were all male. And, you know, supply chain logistics has not been the most diverse industry or the, you know, set of functions in, you know, traditionally. Gartner's supply chain DEI study for 2022 also showed the companies that not only diverse companies outperform, you know, companies that are less diverse, but also candidates want to work at diverse companies. And so if you look at supply chains, you know, in this crisis that supply chains are in, there's a real war for talent in this, because all of a sudden it's one of the most important things in a company. And to get that talent, you know, if you can cast a wider net because you're trying to access more diversity, and then the you know, candidates that you have, if they are more attracted to working at your company because it is a, you know, a more diverse place that they want to work at, you know, those companies are going to win.
Yeah, every time.
Yeah, and in addition, the Gartner study found that, you know, the companies that clearly state their DEI goals and tie leadership compensation to achieving those goals, those are the ones that are the most effective at it. And that's, I mean, a novel idea that incentivizing something that matters is going to get you results in it. But it, you know,
Yeah,
makes
it's
sense.
interesting. And, you know, so the things that we've talked about kind of are hitting on ideas of regulation or incentives or requirements. I want to take a step back. You know, as you and I have discussed, the genesis of this work is that it's actually meant to do something good, right? Like that it's coming from a place of soul, coming from a place of hopefulness, outside of meeting standards, right? And I mean, you know me, I'm a glass half full kind of person. I totally believe in it. I'd love to hear, you know, again, beyond the standards, beyond the regs, like what have you seen from a leadership perspective, you know, maybe a business example that you have or an individual example that you have, where you've just been really impressed, where you're like, you know what, that's just awesome. Like that's good work that's meeting the standard, but it's coming from a really good place.
Yeah, you know, area I've been really impressed in is when leaders in supply chain take the concepts and they put it into examples that are really easy to communicate, share, and scale for everyone in the company. For example, one of the companies, they converted a type of waste into equivalent mass of adult African elephants and shared that around the company by talking about thousands of elephants of this mass created in manufacturing and transportation. And it made it real for people. They said, well, how many elephants would fit in, this conference room? How many elephants would fit on the floor, or even in the entire building that we're in? And it made it real for people, and it made it visual, and you could scale it. Another company used how many thousands, or actually hundreds of thousands, of adult pine trees worth of carbon they were generating each year in different activities. And you could see, okay, well, how many acres worth of trees or hectares worth of trees does that translate into? And people understood it a whole lot better, and they said, wow, okay, these things, this is where it really means something, and it generates, hey, we need to go do something about this.
Yeah,
Right?
and having it be part of the conversation means that the organization cares and that it's paying attention, and gives people motivation to be part of the solution.
Right.
Yeah, amazing. Okay, so we've talked about all of the work that's happening. I'd love to transition into how people are tracking this work. Obviously, there's a lot of intention and doing good and meeting benchmarks. Have you found the tracking to be easy, hard, getting it back to the larger corporate team, the larger impact team? Like, where do you see the work today?
I think maybe some companies are doing it well. I think across a lot of companies, it's fragmented. There's a lot of good intentions, but people are doing things a little bit differently. And a lot of companies that I see are following directions from major retailers, that major retailers say, okay, this is my platform, and this is the way I want you to put this information in. Not only are those platforms different in their content, and the way you put the information in, and I'm assuming in the way that things are calculated, but also what I'm seeing is companies are not able to enter all of that information consistently. And so I don't know how accurate or how fully complete that information is across different industries, across retailers, and be able to compare those things, and even within a value chain of a group, to ensure that different suppliers are consistent within that, and in their full representation of their operations. I think it's challenged. That, again, a lot of good intentions, but there's a lot of different ways that it's being done.
Yeah, and as we've both sort of built our careers on this model that if it's not measured, it isn't managed, it's a pain point. And it's exactly why we created Ethos Tracking and included supply chain. We didn't, only include philanthropy and donations and, what's going on with employee engagement. We specifically have a home for supply chain and for sustainability, because we know that this work is happening in dynamic ways, that it needs to be looked at as part of the larger corporate impact, footprint. And we hope people are able to do their good work better, right? By being able to track it cleanly. So I really appreciate you taking the time to have this conversation. Any final thoughts?
No, I look forward to seeing the stuff that Ethos is producing, and keep it coming.
Awesome. Thanks so much for taking the time, Jerry, and thanks for everything you do to move this work forward.
Yeah, thank you. Good to see you again.